This is Dan McLaughlin, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Once again, we meet in the middle and we try to talk things out. I know you write some amazing things on the National Review. Is that the main thing that you do now? Is that your sole effort? Are you writing books? What else are you doing besides that?
That's my full-time job, writing at National Review, and I'm a fellow at National Review Institute, which more or less supports the, similar work. And I have some book projects in the works, which I'm not really at liberty to talk about publicly just yet.
Yeah.
So basically, this is it. I've been out of practicing the law and commuting into Manhattan for 3 years now. So.
Mhm. Speaking of practicing the law in Manhattan and all of that, I guess I want to jump into these Trump indictments. Let's start there because everybody gets crazy. Donald Trump has become porn for both sides of the everybody. Like they just are desperate to see what's going to happen next. But what are your overall thoughts? You have a 5-piece series on National Review. I'll put a link up for that right now. But what are your thoughts?
Well, the Washington Post, I think, had a big piece today about the advancement of AI porn. So it creates the frightening spectacle of an AI Donald Trump that the law can continue to pursue for the next century.
Oh,
The reality is that look, it's a big step. It's a very big step to indict a former president, right? And I think generally, if you are a prosecutor, you should try in all cases, really, to prosecute the cases that are clearly violations of the law and not try to come up with creative theories for stretching the law to something that wouldn't have been obvious to most people was a crime. Or maybe that the courts have never concluded was a crime. Now, sometimes you deal with unusual crimes, right? But to do that in a first ever prosecution of a former president, and not only to try to stretch the law, but to stretch the law in numerous directions at once, I think is a really bad sign. And there are a couple of investigations going of Trump right now, right? And until we see what they produce, it's debatable exactly how strong they are, right? There's a Georgia investigation that essentially is investigating Trump and people around him for state election law crimes regarding the 2020 election, specifically the post-election efforts to overturn the result.
right.
There is a federal special prosecutor who is investigating Trump for holding classified documents at Mar-a-Lago, for possibly obstructing the government when it tried to get those back, and maybe also looking into Trump for various ways to blame him for the January 6th riots at the Capitol. And so you have a couple of things there that involve maybe, we'll see what comes out of them, maybe a clear crime. Maybe in the case of the Mar-a-Lago documents, maybe a crime that the prosecutor will have trouble justifying because of the way that Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton were let off the hook for similar kinds of things. At the same time, like particularly with the Georgia situation, you have, grave matters of state. Nobody but a presidential candidate would be indicted for this precise kind of conduct. But all of those things are much more sort of real and serious than what Alvin Bragg has done here, right? Bragg is, and the contrast here to Bill Clinton is really striking, right?
Mm.
Trump is essentially alleged to have lied to his checkbook. Literally, that's the whole case, right? The case is Trump made hush money payments to Stormy Daniels, this adult film performer, we'll call her, to cover up an affair that she says they had, which I suspect they did have, or he wouldn't have paid her all that money for it, but it's obviously not actually proven other than just her say-so and the money. But there's nothing illegal about that, right? Hush money is totally legal. Concealing things from the voters is legal. Spending your own money to support your own campaign is legal. And overpaying your taxes is legal. The way they seem to have documented this is that Michael Cohen, Trump's fixer, paid off Daniels. Trump paid off Cohen to reimburse him, but they called it legal fees, and they gave Cohen twice as much money. So then he paid taxes on it as if it were legal fees. So he basically overpaid his taxes to cover this up. Again, no law against all of that. So Bragg's theory is, well, you guys were scheming to defraud somebody to cover up a felony, some felony. He hasn't specified in either of those cases who or what, by making these false business entries in your checkbook and in Cohen's invoices to Trump and in Trump's checks to Cohen. And then these were falsely reported on the books of the Trump organization, although so far as I can tell, they were not on like the operating business side, because the Trump organization is this like umbrella of all of these companies, right? And at least one of them is the Donald J. Trump Revocable Trust, which appears to be just where Trump holds the money that the business throws off for his benefit. And another one of them is just Trump's own account, which again appears to be just Trump's personal account. So literally, these are accounts of the Trump organization. Again, so far as I can tell, I may be wrong about this, but I haven't seen any evidence suggesting otherwise. These are accounts of the Trump organization that are basically just places to hold Donald Trump's money that he can spend however he wants. I don't believe, and Bragg certainly hasn't alleged, that Trump took the payoffs through Cohen to Daniels as business expenses on his taxes or anything like that. I suspect Bragg would have alleged that if he had done it. So all of this boils down to Trump lied about it in his checkbook. The checkbook is everything in the checkbook gets entered into the books of the Trump organization for these two accounts for Trump's benefit. And so Bragg says these are false business records, right? But if you look at the cases, the New York cases, false business records, you still need to show an intent to defraud and that it's a material falsehood, right? In other words, that this could really persuade somebody of something. And there's no indication that Trump or Cohen ever wanted these checks or invoices, business records, or any of this to see the light of day. They were. I drew this analogy in my column to people. People lie in private documents or conceal the truth in private documents without any intention to deceive anybody, right? You probably did this in the military. Right? You write things that are coded, or you leave things out. There are certain things you don't want on paper, not because you're trying to scam somebody, because you don't want somebody else finding it. Right. When I was a practicing lawyer, if we were working on like a merger or acquisition case, right, you'd use code names for the companies. Not because you were trying to scam somebody else into thinking that this company was named like Donut or something, right? Or Mouse or whatever. You're trying to convince somebody. You're trying to ensure that nobody who accidentally runs across these documents is going to be able to get to the truth, right? I think that's what Trump and Cohen. All the evidence we have is that that's what Trump and Cohen were doing. Is they were trying to, they were trying to cover something up to start with. So they recorded it in a way that's deceptive, but not aimed at deceiving anybody in particular. And there's nothing in the law of New York that says that you can prosecute somebody for false business entries for that. On top of that, then Bragg is he says that, to turn this into a felony. And if it's not a felony, then it's absolutely barred by the statute of limitations, right? He's trying to turn this into a felony by saying it was to cover up some other violation of law. Maybe tax law, maybe election law. He seems to be suggesting it was a federal election violation. He still hasn't specified which one or by whom. So again, and as you go down through the other pieces of this case, you see all this stuff like this, right? You see things that he's just pushing the law in places it hasn't gone. The case is more than the payments were more than 5 years ago. He has to come up with some additional theory why, even if it's a felony, it's not barred by the statute of limitations. He could probably get around that, but it requires creativity there too. So there's so much going on with this indictment that is just pushing the envelope in multiple directions, and not just in technical ways, but in ways that go to the heart of, is this a crime or not? And then you compare it to Bill Clinton, right? Bill Clinton lied. Like, perjury is one of those things. Perjury is not this like complicated false records to conceal it. Perjury is a straight up crime. Like from the moment you start watching lawyer courtroom shows on TV as a kid, you know that if you lie under oath, they can send you to jail for it, right?
Right.
Everybody who's been in a courtroom knows that. Simple crime. Clinton lied about it, straight up lied under oath in order to thwart a civil lawsuit. And so, Clinton lied to a court. Trump lied to his checkbook, and yet, Clinton was deemed to be above the law. Democrats behaved as if he was above the law, as if it was a terrible thing for him to be even investigated. And they've sort of come around over the years, right? After Hillary Clinton lost in 2016, you started to see more liberals and even some Democratic politicians saying, yeah, maybe Clinton being a sexual predator was not so great. But even to this day, I have not heard anybody in that side of the world say, you know what, Clinton really should have been prosecuted for this stuff. Ken Starr just died in September. And you will not find any Democratic politicians, any liberal or progressive columnists or TV hosts saying, you know what, we were wrong. Ken Starr was right. This was a grave matter. He was trying to prove the president's not above the law, and we should have sided with him.
We've also, you mentioned earlier, talked about these classified document cases. This is setting precedent, I think, at least where if someone has we'll just give all of these senior people the break and that they weren't trying to do anything illegal to harm America. But all of a sudden, classified documents are a whole lot less protected. You and I couldn't have a bunch of secret information scattered across our garage. We certainly couldn't have TS-SCI multiple times on a server in our garage without losing our freedom and a lot of money for a very long time. Now that that's a fact, that and this is like, I'm not a lawyer, but I am a counterintelligence agent, and I understand what it takes to protect top secret. And if you're the Secretary of State and you want to keep TS in your house, there's a process, there's paperwork, and you probably could legally influence that. You could legally do it. The president can basically say, this is unclassified, but someone who's got the title of, SSO has to go, oh shit, I better make sure that all the paperwork is done. These things have processes. If we're not going to protect the process at the top, then there is no process. Anybody right now could be leaking information. And I'm going to go into the leaking thing. There is so much stuff that's illegally leaked in this case and many other cases. Does it even matter anymore? Should we protect anything? Should we just let everything be in the open? What is the point if we're not going to hold ourselves accountable?
Yeah, and I mean, we still had damaging leaks, just this week about the Ukraine war. And I mean, look, I think there are two things that are clear about, secret and classified and otherwise sensitive government information. One is that we have no law. We do not really have law, right? We have rules that are applied to some people and not to other people. And you can say Trump ought to be prosecuted and so should these other people, or you can say Trump shouldn't be and neither should these people. But to have this sort of unclarity about when the rules matter and when they don't, we don't have law. The other thing we don't have is we don't have security. I mean, clearly, even some of this stuff, look, did the documents leak from Joe Biden's garage to Hunter Biden to be sold on the black market in China for diamonds or something? I mean, we don't have proof of that, but how do we know that didn't happen? How do we know? We just don't know. That's the whole problem with all these things. It's whether it's Trump's house, Biden's house, Hillary's server, even Mike Pence's house. They've just stuff lying around it. A thing I don't understand. I mean, look, I understand why a senior person who travels constantly, who does not create classified documents, but is constantly reviewing them with other people.
Right.
I understand why they personally would, at a certain point, not even know what they've got with them, what they don't. They like the Secretary of State can't just say, I'm only going to read this stuff in a skiff when the Secretary of State is on the road half the year and like flying to meet foreign diplomats. You can't show up and meet like the leader of like India and be like, yeah, so let's put a pin in that and I'll go fly home and read some more stuff and then I'll answer your question, right? You got to have stuff with you. But I, for the life of me, and maybe it's that I've never been quite at that level in the room with those people making those decisions. I don't know why you don't, as say the vice president or the Secretary of State or the president, why there isn't just somebody on your staff whose whole job it is to keep track of the sensitive documents and information and ensure that, you know, those things are traveled with securely, that they are presented to you when you need them, and that when you're done with them, they are collected and, you know, and they go back home. And, you know, there's a funny story about Justice Stevens when he's on the Supreme Court. Used to like take briefs to the beach to read with him, and like, you know, one time he opens a brief like on the bench and all this sand pours out, right? So I get that sometimes, yeah, you want to be able to read some things in your downtime, but again, just, you know, why isn't there just like a box? Like we, you know, we've all seen like the British, right? They have the red dispatch boxes. There's one that goes to the Queen. There's one that goes everywhere with the Prime Minister and stuff. They've been using those same boxes since like the 19th century, right? But you know, I don't understand why there aren't better protocols in place to allow the senior people to see classified stuff when they need it, where they need it, and yet ultimately have those things reside in the custody of somebody who will actually keep them secure and whose whole job it is to keep them secure.
This won't surprise you, but all of that stuff is covered and it's constantly updated. And so there's protocols for transferring classified up to and including top secret. If you have a top secret document and you want to walk to the beach and read it, there's a protocol for that. And they actually have that person on staff, and that person's, but if no one's going to enforce it, it's just not a law. There's all kinds of everything you said, just like the defense of I didn't know it was classified. Doesn't matter. You sign a piece of paper. It says saying I don't know is not a defense, right? All of these things are accounted for. But if no one's going to enforce it, if no one's going to make a big deal about it, unless you're from the wrong political party, then you're right. There is no law. So we have laws that cover all of these things. Could they use some updating? Sure, but we're not even doing. Here's another thing. It's an actual fact. When you have a leak,
but as I said, they may be laws, but they're not rules.
Right, right. And then if you find out that your Secretary of State has TSSCI on a server in her garage, there's an actual requirement, a legal requirement, that someone now has to do a counterintelligence investigation on each leak to determine who got killed, what was compromised. But I don't think they ever did that. And we certainly didn't see the news from it. So this is the thing that we all know happened. The Secretary of State admits to it and says, I've taken responsibility, but the responsibility part never came due. And again, if we're changing these rules, then where do the rules apply? When do they apply? At what level do they apply? Because why are we pissed off at Ed Snowden or Julian Assange or anybody if you're not going to follow rules because, I don't know, because of the level of the government you're in? And you're right, man. Classified information and traveling all over the place, it would be a pain in the ass. Let's figure out a way to deal with that. But let's not act like we don't have rules already, and that there is not someone on that staff saying, ma'am or sir, you cannot do that. That is against the law. I don't want to go to jail. Here's the other thing. If you see this happening and you're on that staff, you're bound by U.S. regulation to report it. Even if you did it to yourself, you know what? I threw a thumb drive in the wrong hole, and I've compromised myself. You're required by law. Now, like, you're not going to get prosecuted for that. They're going to go for the bigger charge, but there's an actual legal requirement for that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and look, I understand that people don't say no to you very often when you're the president, but
right.
You know, there's still, look, if you're on Joe Biden's Secret Service detail and he's like, I'm going to go, you know, skinny dipping in the pool, as he's been known to do around his Secret Service detail, and he's like, toss me the nuclear football over here, fellas, while I'm like naked in the water. They're going to be like, Mr. President, that's where we draw the line, right? And
right.
You would think that the kinds of lines that, as you said, that lines that were drawn all the time around you and other people you were with, that somebody at least would have the ability and the authority to enforce those around the people at the top.
Right. And things that are TSS, we'll set equipment aside and that kind of thing. Things, it could be like my name. You know, Pete is running this agent in Zabul province of Afghanistan. And that's a classified operation. So you're allowed to read about it, but much like Donald Trump's checkbook, my name is going to be protected. Certainly the source is not only going to be protected, like there's going to be a source number and then probably an identity above that to protect that source, because when these things leak out, you know, people die. And that's the level of classification we're talking about here, like the capability of our equipment, how it works, who is working on things that are life and death situations. And so these aren't trivial matters. So if we're going to change the rules, that's fine, but let the people on the ground know, hey, We're not going to protect your identity. It could be in someone's garage. It could be in their Corvette. It could be at their palatial estate in Florida. And so know that before you go into the wildland and go perform these operations.
Yeah, and and one of the other lessons with that, of course, is that one of the things we saw with the whole Russiagate thing is that we really have totally blurred the lines between law enforcement and national security in ways that have empowered prosecutors and career service, civil service people down the food chain to go after even the sitting commander in chief using the law as a weapon. And that's bad. That's unhealthy. That's like, taken when you let that fester long enough, you may start with no man is above the law, but you end up with the Praetorian Guard. You end up with, as they used to describe the Tsarist Russia as an autocracy tempered by assassination.
Yeah. I just want to make this point on like what is possible within the law, right? So in my world, in the counterintelligence world, there is a line item in one of the regulations, not a classified regulation. Anyone can look this up. And this authorizes me as a counterintelligence agent, if I get the right approval, to conduct human experimentation, which is like a gruesome, ghoulish thing. Like, why is Pete doing this? Oh, well, the secretary, I think it's Health and Human Services. I think that's the ultimate authority. If they give me the thumbs up, I can now conduct human experiments as a counterintelligence agent, right? So you can do a lot of wild shit within the law, but you have to do the paperwork. You have to.
Yeah, and I will give. By the way, this is where I give one star, a little bit of credit to the Chief Justice, because I know he drives conservatives nuts and often liberals as well. But if nothing else, John Roberts is the government's leading stickler for, like, you dot your I's, you cross your T's, you do the process, and that's how we know that they if you did that, we'll give you a lot more deference than if you didn't.
Again, I'll bring myself back into this. If I was to go work against a foreign government on behalf of the United States, I'm looking for somebody who's not dotting I's and crossing T's. I'm looking for somebody who drinks too much, someone who womanizes or manizes. I'm looking for people that are not doing what they're supposed to do because they're a target, because I think they're exploitable. And so, like that, also, like all of these espionage breaks into our Congress, that there's way more than we can even account for, because we don't spend time cleaning house. Nothing happens to someone. I would be able to, as an agent, say, hey, listen, Swalwell or Feinstein or whoever it's going to be, no one's going to care. No one's going to care about this. I'll protect you. We'll protect you in our end. I'll take care of everything. It would be a career defining moment to have me get an agent on a senator's staff, again, if I was in an adversarial position to the United States. So all of this stuff, it is a bunch of bullshit if we're going to act like we care about these things. And I love that John Roberts is holding people accountable. Like, if you would have done the paperwork, President Trump, this wouldn't be a problem. This is secret shit. It's not a big deal.
And look, the voters are partly to blame for this, right? And this goes back to the Clinton years and now Trump. Is that the real answer shouldn't be to send guys like Bill Clinton and Donald Trump to jail. The real answer is that once the voters figure out that they're exactly the sort of person who has all these vulnerabilities, maybe just don't put them in the White House.
Yeah. Be honest with yourselves and hold your party and hold your candidates accountable. When the Democratic Party flat rejected, I got as many delegates as Vice President Harris. When your party rejects someone, don't turn around and say it's the greatest thing of all time. Don't lie to us, right? And so all of that stuff, I want to push all that stuff aside and talk briefly about Clarence Thomas, because this is the latest target du jour. Maybe Clarence Thomas has broken the law, but I believe a judge who's got a staff of lawyers, when he says, hey, we've looked into this, this is no big deal. And if we're going to start looking at the favors that judges get from the community of rich people that they live and play amongst, who's not guilty of getting a vacation here and there, or staying in someone's place in the Caribbean?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think that Thomas broke any laws, and I think it's pretty clear that even a lot of his critics are basically having to admit, no, he didn't do anything illegal. We just think that there should be more disclosure rules on this stuff. I mean, Thomas says, and I believe him because this is consistent with how the court has done some of these things, that he went to other colleagues and said, early on, and said, like, do I got to disclose this kind of, because they do have required disclosures, right?
Right.
They file required disclosures. And so, if he was receiving large cash gifts, that's one thing, right? They got to disclose that kind of thing. But his point was, well, look, if I'm just going on a trip with a friend, and it's a rich friend, so it's a nice trip. A really rich friend, so it's a really nice trip. Because we don't have to do that. One of the things, for example, the court, I mean, the main conflict of interest rule is not about whether the justices are, getting gifts from rich people. It's about whether they've received anything from anyone who might come before the court. Right now, there's no indication that Harlan Crow has ever had a case before the court that Thomas sat on. But one of the big things that they did early in the 90s, I think it might have been right after Thomas got on the court, and so probably exactly when they were having these conversations, is that a bunch of the justices got together and did this joint letter about, well, what do you do if, as often happens, you're a Supreme Court justice and you have children or other family members who are also lawyers? Because, what do you grow up to do if your dad is a Supreme Court justice? Or in Ginsburg's case, if you marry a lawyer, and so they set up sort of basically a bunch of guidelines. They didn't write rules exactly in the way that Congress does, but they said, look, we're going to write this letter. We're going to release it to the public. It'll say, look, this is, these are the policies we're going to follow. Like, if to figure out which cases we have to recuse ourselves from and which we don't. So it's like, if my kid is a partner in a law firm with 300 lawyers and, they are in a case in front of the Supreme Court, like, does that mean I have to recuse myself? And they sort of come up with some rules, like, oh, well, if they're like the guy who originated the business, if it's his case, obviously you got to recuse yourself. If like you're sort of walled off generally from income on the Supreme Court, the firm's Supreme Court practice, if they have a specific Supreme Court, they came up with all these rules, and the rules make reasonable sense when you read them. That you could come out differently if you were writing them yourself, maybe, but they did that. They did that in a process that was not lawmaking, but it was publicly transparent, and it involved a bunch of the justices getting together. Chief Justice Rehnquist at the time, I think, wrote his signatures on the letter along with a couple of the others. So it was a reasoned attempt at that. I mean, I have no problem with saying that there ought to be a few more restrictions and disclosure rules. I mean, the one Supreme Court justice who was actually hounded off the bench for this kind of stuff, Abe Fortas, who was actually, he was nominated to be Chief Justice. He was filibustered. Sort of some of the ethical issues that came out during that filibuster were part of what sank him. And then he ultimately resigned. But the big thing that pushed him off the bench really is that he was more or less on retainer from this rich guy who had serious legal problems and was looking for him to, I don't think he was looking so much for Fortas to compromise himself on the bench as for Fortas to intervene with the SEC and such, the agencies, and put in a good word for this guy. And so that, that's real corruption. That's not just, you went to a friend's, lake house in Vienna or something, or wherever. It's you're literally on retainer as if you're this guy's private lawyer.
Right. Yeah. Why does the left hate Clarence Thomas so much? I mean, he is such a wonderful, look, his politics aside and his preference for how he sees the law. This guy came from almost nothing with every chance to not make it. And here he is at the top of his profession, and they hate him so much. And I'm like, look, hate is politics. That's fine. But look he's the American dream. He's the epitome of it. He says, like, I want to master the English language, and he writes beautifully. I mean, this guy is not supposed to be where he is, but America gave him an opportunity, and he was damned if he was going to miss out on it. I mean, you don't even have to like him as a person, but you have to like where he's ended up and how far he came. This is why people came here from Sweden, from Puerto Rico, from Mexico, because you can do something special here.
Yeah, and Thomas is, I mean, he has an enormously impressive biography, and he's a very likable guy, just if you see him speak and such. Um, and I think a guy who's down to earth, well liked by his colleagues, by the people who work at the court who are not justices.
Right.
He does sort of famously like to drive around the country in his RV.
Yeah. We're supposed to love that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, okay. He also goes on, has gone on fancy vacations with his rich friend, but
Right.
I think there's a bunch of reasons they hate him. I mean, they hated Scalia too for not just having conservative ideas, but sort of advancing them in a way that was, intellectually rigorous. So obviously there's a sort of conceit in particularly progressive circles that there's no such thing as a smart person who disagrees with them, right? So anybody who is, erudite and thoughtful and puts in the work, they hate them all the more, right? They'd much rather deal with somebody who's an obvious idiot, because then they could say, well, look, that's the opinion that idiots hold, right?
Yeah,
that's why they don't really in their guts hate Trump nearly as much as they hated, say, Marco Rubio or Paul Ryan. But so that's part of it. Part of it obviously is like the fact that he's black, and there's I think there is, conservatives overstate sometimes this idea that like Democrats want all the black voters on their plantation. I think it is sometimes offensive to black conservatives even to talk about black voters in that way, as if they don't have choice in the matter. But but there is some of that mentality still among sort of white liberals that like, this is supposed to be our people. And even even among like black liberals and progressives that like, oh, we're supposed to all stick together, and you're turning against what we think is the politics that must follow from being a black American. So there's that. And obviously he was introduced to the country during the whole Anita Hill thing. And so there are certainly people who they believed that story when it came out, and they have hated him ever since. So there's a combination of all that. And now the fact that with Scalia gone, he is the intellectual leader of the conservative wing on the court. And the court is divided, with 5 votes for overturning Roe, 5 votes for a number of these, the more conservative outcomes. And so getting rid of Thomas would be, or any of the other 4 would be an enormous value to them. Yeah, so there is that desire to just personally take a scalp.
Yeah, which seems petty. I mean, it's the person is, he's been there, whoever it's going to be, they're there, let's not get petty. Leave the court alone, for crying out loud, and then openly, condone packing or whatever. I'm all for reconfiguring the court, but I don't trust the fuckers in charge, whoever's in charge, to do it in a way that benefits the people. So let's just leave these things as they are. You want to talk baseball?
Sure. Go ahead. I mean, we're only a few critical players down from the Mets roster so far. So, obviously when you're, it's the middle of April, it's not even quite the midpoint of April yet. And your ace pitcher hasn't started yet. Your closer is probably out for the season, and your starting catcher's out for 8 weeks. And your number 3 starter is not supposed to appear until July. So it's, it is the usual Mets fiasco. The Rays are really interesting though.
They're hot. Yeah. Going back to, and
it's a roster kind of full of a lot of nobodies. It is they again have, as is characteristic when a team is this hot, this far overachieving beyond what you think of as their visible talent level. Their defense has been amazing. I mean, the team ERA is so far below where it should be for how the pitchers are pitching.
Yeah. I want to go back to the Mets because you also have your last year's Cy Young signee that you brought in, and he's got, a hitch in his giddy up, and hopefully, and I'm all for Verlander. I want to see him get the 300 wins, but it seems to me that players are so peaked in their performance that they are not fragile, but the difference between able to perform and not able to perform it's stark compared to what it used to be. You'll hear Scherzer, right? And as another Mets pitcher, he'll say, I've got a little bit of a hamstring problem. It's not a pull, but there's something going on back there. He knows how to pitch through it, but they'll put him on the bench before he actually gets hurt because they're so aware of their bodies now. Is this just like a? Do you agree with that position that these
Yeah,
guys
no,
are
I think
so?
I think
Yeah.
it is, and it's look, that's kind of a problem with modern technology in some ways too, right?
Hmm.
Is that the more specialized and more refined and more complex the machinery is, the fewer things it takes to go wrong before everything is completely
Right.
off where it's supposed to be functioning, right? You can't just, I mean, look at your car, right? You can't just go out
Oh,
and be like, stick a few wires together, turn a few cranks, and the thing's running again, right? You've got an
yeah.
electrical system, you've got, I mean, this is, I mean, I went off on a rant on this the other day, about a couple of weeks ago, about the military, right? Like the Navy used to just, like the Civil War, the Second World War, they were just like, oh crap, we're at war, we don't have enough ships, and then they just churned that massive numbers of ships, and like,
Yeah.
you can't do that anymore. You don't, the ships are too complicated. There's all this high sensitive computer equipment and everything, and maybe you got a nuclear reactor, your fighters and everything are so complicated. They have such a long chain. And so baseball players are a feature of that too. They're not, it's like Babe Ruth, with his hot dogs and everything. Like, I mean, Ruth was often in better shape than we remember him. But the point is
Yeah.
that, when Ruth was out of shape or hungover, it didn't matter nearly as much as it would today.
Right.
Today these guys they are conditioned to such a sort of point of a spear, that when they're off just a little bit, it makes a huge difference.
When we grew up, and we're approximately the same age, I remember, like, the guys threw fast. Maybe Nolan Ryan threw 100 miles an hour, but you didn't throw 100 and have the ball move 14 inches vertically or horizontally or both. I mean, the amount of movement on these pitches that are in the 90s, it something has changed in the game that allows that. And maybe what pitchers think is good grip on a ball wasn't possible 40 years ago. But part of this problem with strikeouts in the game degrading is that the ball is moving so much more than it used to.
Yeah, and I think really there's been a revolution in the last. There were always the guys who maybe would have great velocity and movement together, but often it was, somebody like Dwight Gooden who would sort of reach that moment and only stay on it for a little while.
Right.
You know, uh, but I think that clearly there's been a sort of inside the game scientific breakthrough, right, in the
Hmm.
last 10, 15, 20 years, where they're able to teach the pitchers in particular so much more about their, like, the release angles and the mechanics and everything.
Right.
Mike Marshall is really kind of in some ways the father of that as a science. Like, he was long ahead of his time.
Yeah.
um, but um, but it's so that, you see these guys who come into the league and they actually are improving their velocity, improving, the movement on the break on their pitches and stuff in ways that you used to just think, well, the guy comes in and maybe he'll improve his command, he may improve the mental
Yeah.
aspect of his game, his control, his ability to repeat the mechanical things he's doing right, but the ability to just, like, put another yard on your fastball after you're, like, 25 years old and in the major leagues, like
Right.
that didn't used to happen. And it does
Yeah.
now. And I don't think it's just like a steroids thing. I mean, yeah, we saw
Yeah.
some guys within the Royd era like that, but it really is much more of an understanding the sort of the biomechanics of throwing a baseball, and to some extent with the hitters too, right? Changing a guy, fiddling with a guy's launch angle and everything.
Yeah. But let's also not act like we would be in any way shocked if there was a massive outbreak of positive tests for steroids. I mean, it's absolutely, look, you don't have to say this. I will say this. It's absolutely true that steroids and performance enhancing drugs are still being used in all professional sports. It's just the testing is never able to keep up with where it is. Is it happening in baseball right now? Yes. I mean, Fernando Tatis was doing it. If he's doing it, there's a lot of other people doing it. It's just very hard to catch.
Yeah, and I'm sure that they are, when we look back at this era, probably there will be things we'll find out people were taking that are like, were unanticipated a decade ago, that maybe
Right.
aren't even technically against the rules right now, right? We had that in the 90s. Some of the stuff, May
Yeah.
McGuire had that stuff in his locker. And they're like,
Anderson down. Yeah.
yeah, and they're like, well, there's no rule against that. Then they made one. But up to that point, there was no rule against it. And he just didn't even bother hiding that he was taking it.
Yeah. And maybe that's, you take that kind of a Formula One sort of does this, but you take that like this is an unlimited class up here, AAA, yep, no tobacco, none of these things. But when you're in the big leagues, do whatever you want. If you want to live to be 42 and have a great career and you ingest every single drug you can to be better, knock yourself out. This
Yeah,
is
the
this
old
is what you do.
SNL when Dennis Miller was hosting it. I think they had a whole steroid Olympics sketch. Remember this where they're like, oh yeah, in the steroid Olympics you can take wherever they want, and they have like a
Yeah.
guy pulling up the weight, and then his arms fall off. But
Yes.
and look, there's this comes back to my whole theory about rules, right? Though that, but if guys are doing something to get an edge and they're like weaseling their way around the rules so they're not
Yeah.
getting caught, then just change the rules, make an announcement, and going forward, you punish that. I'm not a big fan of the whole, we're going to sort of retcon enforcement and we're going to do it unevenly and retroactively. And I don't think that's any better in baseball than it is in politics.
Yeah. If I was commissioner, I would implement a rule where you have to start every pitching motion with both feet. The toes have to be on the rubber. You can point backwards if you want, whatever, but both toe beds have to be on the rubber. I think that would allow more stolen bases and just create some problems for pitchers that they need to kind of balance the game out.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that even though they've come up with a bunch of rules that are tinkering with the mechanics of the game, right? And
Right.
I can live with some of them. I'm not a huge, I mean, other than the ghost base runner is the one that offends me the most because it's actually removing the amount of baseball that's in your baseball game. But it does seem that even though they're trying to get more speed, they do seem to have sort of thrown off the pitchers a little bit, but they're not solving the fundamental problem that there's too many strikeouts in the game at this point. And strikeouts are fun, but up to a point. But nobody goes to a baseball game to see like 17 strikeouts every night, right? Like
Yeah.
you just at that point you may as well go watch the Little League because that's where you're going to see that level of baseball.
Yeah.
Right, where like people don't know how to field because there's only like 2 balls in play every game. So the major leagues should be, there should be balls in play.
Yeah.
And you can't just sort of, you can't like tell the managers to like play for more balls in play. They're trying to win. Same with the GMs. They're trying to build, winning rosters. So what you need to do is at that point you do need to tinker with, you can mess with the strike zone. There's certainly things like that you can do. They've done that in the past with the strike zone, the height of the mound. Like they've made changes to try to even up the balance between the pitchers and the hitters.
Yeah. Yeah. I like the pitch calling machine that they have now, PitchCom. I like the clock. I got to admit, I've always kind of been a fan for that. I like the fact that puts the pitcher under more stress physically. So this is more of an aerobic activity than just anaerobic in pitching. I don't mind the bigger bases. I want to see people trying to steal because Rob Meyer came on the show before the season started, and we both remembered, in the '80s where he had that cutaway screen of we'll just say Vince Coleman, and he's impacting the game from first base with the lead that he's getting, and he's going to take second base, and there was like this game within the game, and it just created a lot more excitement. I'm looking forward to seeing some more of that, and hopefully with these enhanced rules, the teams can now go, hey, we're going to value speed more than we currently have.
And because I think one of my theories, certainly this was one of my theories of drafting my fantasy baseball teams, but even in analyzing the game this year, and I think we'll see how well it plays out, but I think we've seen some signs of this, is that making base stealing easier it's going to help everybody run more. There's a lot of these guys who didn't run before, ran only a little. But I think clearly it's going to have a disproportionately big impact on the guys who are elite base thieves, right? So your guys who are maybe elite base thieves stealing 35, 40 bases a year under the old rules, now, with conditions of the game that were not favorable to running, you're going to see some of them rack up some big numbers, and you'll start to see maybe, teams putting a little more emphasis on bringing people along who could possibly be the next 80 stolen bases a year guy.
Yeah, it's crazy. I saw in the Dodgers when they were playing the Diamondbacks that guy Carroll, he stole third base, and I'm like, what is this? like that move, that strategic advantage had almost completely died in baseball. And now you got a guy who's fast, and they've closed the distance up by about 4.5 inches, which doesn't seem much when you talk about distance. But you and I both know at the major league level, there are hundreds of outs every year that are decided by well less than 4.5 inches. And so you're talking about a real advantage to now get to third base. Wow. There's a lot of ways to score from third.
Yeah, and you will see some guys. I mean, we saw O'Neill Cruz, for example. You will see some guys get hurt because they're still adjusting to, the size of the bag, the rules about who can slide where and who can block what parts of the baseline and all. And that's unfortunate. But I think once you get past that adjustment period, people will exploit the new rules the way they always have. And sometimes it takes a while. I mean, look at the 3-point shot in the NBA. Nobody, they put the 3-point shot in. Nobody immediately went to hoisting up 300 threes a year, right? But it built over time. Guys experimented. They saw what they could do with the three. Obviously, they went to overkill when the league moved the line back for a couple of years in the mid 90s. You have guys like John Starks and Vernon Maxwell just heaving up just preposterous quantities of threes. And they decided that was too much. But I mean, if you've seen scatter plots of where shots are taken in the NBA, right? And they used to be much more all around the court, and they've really gravitated towards either you shoot from the three or you're closer into the paint. There's a lot fewer mid-range jumpers now. But so teams adjusted their strategies to the rules.
Are you excited about the Mets this year, or are you a little concerned?
Well, both. I get my hopes up every year anyway, somehow. It would have been nice to get to opening day with the roster intact, so you could at least sort of project that from there before the wheels start coming off. I do think that, it's going to be really hard for them to win the division, right? They've got too many, the holes they've got right now in what's supposed to be their roster, put them at a real disadvantage against the Braves. On the other hand, they may have kind of worn themselves out down the stretch, and the Braves too, by the intense pace of the race to win the division. And the Phillies didn't, and who ended up with the last laugh in the NL playoffs. So, but I think this is, I think if you get, look, all the marbles here are, do you get to the end of the season with a playoff berth and with your top of your rotation healthy and on their game? And I think if you have Scherzer and Verlander pitching like they were in, August of last season, then you've got some, and they're developing a lot of good young players. I mean, Omar Narvaez went down, which is bad, but it also means that they're forced to stick Francisco Alvarez on the roster and in the lineup more often, and see, does he really have what it takes to be a contributing major league big bat catcher this year?
Yeah. Rob and I talked about this too. We're awfully hard on teams, and we don't know the number right now with the new playoff format just beginning, but the best team is 21, maybe 20% of the time going to win the whole thing. And then there's the second best team. They take up almost the other 20% again. And then there's everybody else vying for those percentages. So it's really, if you had said, hey, you got a 20% chance of winning the World Series, well, let's just get there and see what happens. You're not going to count on 20%. So it's really a completely different format in the playoffs with that being that far removed from dominance.
Yeah, it's a crapshoot in October to a large extent, and a much larger extent than it was in the past. Before you had wild cards, before you had so many rounds of playoffs. Every time you add another round of playoffs, you stretch the distance between the best team in the regular season and the best odds of winning. And that's unfortunate. I think that certainly if I was running the game, that's not what I would want.
It does kind of promote the idea of giving Scherzer and let's just get to the playoffs. And we know we have Scherzer, we know we have Verlander, whatever, Alonso, whoever all your horses are. Let's rest these guys up, keep them healthy so that when we get there, we're motherfuckers to beat. and we'll take our shot. And you really might manage the season differently now.
Yeah, and I mean, you're treating the division title essentially. The 162 games gets you a participation trophy, basically.
Right. Yeah. And there is some advantage to winning the division, but not enough if you can have fragile dudes that you don't want to get 32 starts out of. Like, let's just get 20 out of these older guys, and then make sure they're healthy for the postseason. And also, like the Dodgers do, let's go sign these guys who are rehabbing and be on the scrap heap, and let's just stuff them on the inactive roster and see if we can raise them from the dead. And if you can, we only need an inning from them, every now and then.
Yeah, and look at, I mean, Joe Torre used to do this with the Yankees, right? He was after his first 2 years in the league, wasn't throwing Mariano Rivera 100 innings a year. He had the 1 year in 2004 when the rest of his bullpen was so weak that he leaned too hard. Torre leaned too hard on Rivera and Tom Gordon, and they kind of broke down against the Red Sox.
Yeah.
But that was notable because it was so unusual for how Torre managed Mariano in that bullpen. And so, you are better off not ending up in that situation in October.
Yeah. What else is interesting to you about baseball so far?
I mean, again, certainly there's a lot of young talent. There's a lot of aggressive base running. It will be very interesting to see, if Ohtani ends up on the market during the regular season.
Yeah.
Because that's going to be wild. And look, obviously, the Mets would be very, very much interested, I think, in him. That's a whole other conversation. Is Ohtani willing to? Yeah. Is he willing to take a ride to the East Coast?
Yeah, and we've been down these kind of roads before. Like you see things like Bo Jackson and all these wonderful players. And Ohtani is such a pleasure, but I get the sense for as long as he is, and then it's going to be gone, and it'll be about, could he ever recover from whatever is going to happen? Just bodies don't stand up at this level too long for this much greatness. There's just going to be a cost. And so I want to see him play. He's playing down the street from me because my house is maybe 10 minutes from the big A. So I want to see it, but man, I wouldn't want him on the Dodgers. I'd be afraid he'd just break down almost instantly because it's just impossible to do what he's doing. And maybe he's the one exception ever, but I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, I do think that plays into your calculation about, who should be putting the most resources into having Ohtani on their roster. It's clearly somebody who's trying to capitalize right now on what he can do for you right now to get you a championship. Because I agree with you, and partly it is because every sports fan of our generation is still traumatized by the sort of the Icarus-like career of Bo Jackson.
Yeah,
but it does seem very hard to sustain doing the two things simultaneously.
Yeah, there's also and I don't have any science behind this, but there is a number that comes up. If you throw 101 miles an hour or higher, there is a length of time that you can do that. And then it goes away forever. Now, maybe you're like Chapman and you're protected and you don't pitch a lot and you're able to maintain it for a long time. But at some point, it goes away, Yeah,
there's only so many bullets in the gun, and it doesn't, there's different ways to manage that and maximize the chances that you get all of them out. But one way or the other, you're going to run out. And that is what makes Nolan Ryan so amazing, is that even compared to the guys of his day, he threw really freaking hard from the beginning of the end to the game, from the beginning of the game to the end of the game, beginning of the season to the end of the season, working in his prime on every fourth day and going the distance in half of his starts and doing that while he was particularly in his youth when he was so wild that he was walking like six guys. He was throwing a preposterous number of pitches per inning. So that was just a freak of nature.
Yeah, and maybe Ohtani is a freak of nature, right? It's just does he have that Icarus thing? Will it get to be, because 101 miles an hour with movement and 50 home runs in a season, that's possible for him. And there's just nobody like that in the records book. So I'm going to enjoy him as long as he can. And if the Dodgers get him, I'll be super excited. I'm going to be excited to watch him wherever he goes, if he goes anywhere. But boy, at some point, it's just not going to work out, I think. So
anyway. Yeah, I mean, because Babe Ruth didn't really do that for more than, it was sort of really only about a year that he was kind of
Right.
doing it both ways. There were guys who did it more in like the 1880s, but it's a
Yeah.
different game. And even then, they typically did not last very long doing both.
One of the other things that Rob and I talked about recently, and we might have discussed this before, but we often compare the past to the present, and you say there's no way that, Babe Ruth could come here and dominate like he did, or he didn't play against black players or Japanese players or players from Venezuela. And while all that's true, to survive the grinding path to go from where Babe Ruth came from to the major leagues, it's not gentle like it is now, and it's impossible now. So like you take any player like LeBron James, and you put him back in the 1920s, and you say, go ahead and dominate in basketball. It's not that simple. I mean, people died from farming, injuries. There were no antibiotics. I mean,
right. I mean, even today, there are not a whole lot of elite athletes, best in their game, who, spent their formative years like in a reform school, right? Like Ruth was more or less an inmate for his teenage years. Right. So,
yeah.
To come up from that is pretty impressive.
Yeah. Yeah. And also the amount of talent you had just to survive at that level, it's remarkable. And so when you try to take someone from this time and put them back in that time, like I think about Jesse Owens basically running in well-made dress shoes with spikes nailed to the bottom. These are like, Oxfords, and he's running in these things. I'm being a little bit silly with that, but not that silly. It's certainly not a modern shoe that's built on science.
Well, that brings to mind, if you recall, Edwin Moses, with his long unbeaten streak in the hurdles, that one race where his shoes came untied. Now, I can hardly think of a worse sport to have your shoes come untied in the middle of what you're doing than the hurdles, right?
Yeah.
But Moses just had such a gift for putting one foot in front of the other right where they needed to be in just the right stride, and he won that race with his laces flopping all over the place. So I mean, these guys can do amazing things, and that's a big part of why we love sports is watching. There's always something new that you've never seen before, and that somebody who is just crazy talented and crazy devoted to the game is able to pull off that you just sit there and you say, wow, I live to see that.
Yeah. I think especially in running, we're seeing some real changes we'll set aside steroids because there's obviously that too, but just the technology and training and being able to know almost like Edwin Moses, where each footfall happens in a marathon. Like we're getting very close to perfection, and a sub 2 hour marathon it's going to happen in an actual sanctioned race. We're very close to this. Middle distances are changing. It's the world of track technology has hit it, and it's stepping. I mean, the ability to micro train like motion for a sprinter to optimize every step, that's happening right now.
Yeah, and obviously the question with that is, the earlier in your career you have to start doing stuff like that, are you going to take the Babe Ruths and the Jesse Owenses and the guys running barefoot in Kenya, and the kids who have to swing their way off the island in the Dominican Republic? Are you going to get to a point where they get boxed out of being able to advance in the sport because they don't get the prime costly training and everything at a young age? I don't think we've reached that point yet. I mean, obviously, like golf and tennis are a little more like that, where it's like, if you're like 11 years old and you haven't sort of mastered the craft, your career is probably already over, right? But I would hate to see that happen to all of the big sports, because it is a joy to see what guys can come from and overcome.
Yeah. And it's great to see an Ichiro come up, and you wouldn't coach that swing, but boy, that swing worked for him. And you want to see some of that uniqueness. And we definitely are coaching that out of baseball players.
Well, I think with Ichiro, I think you would coach that if you were training someone to hit in the Japanese leagues at the time. I mean, right? That's why he came in. He came in with a different swing because he came from a different baseball culture. Much the way that you wouldn't coach Babe Ruth's swing in 1915 for an everyday player, but they kind of let him do it because he was a pitcher. They're like, just swing everywhere they want. Have this big uppercut, nobody cares.
Yeah, grab that gigantic bat. Look at 52-ounce bat. It's almost like a cartoon. That he can. Yeah, it is. If you don't, I get the sense, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but you get the sense that they're the uniqueness of a pitcher's windup is, Fernando, and you can think of all the different players, but it used to be you could actually imitate these things, but they're all very similar now. Like they have coached a lot of that singularity out.
Yeah, and that obviously gives the advantage to the occasional guy who shows up doing something different because
Yeah.
so much of it is hitting his timing, right? And if you're accustomed to seeing that same couple of windups come at you, and then somebody just shows up who's completely different,
Right.
it's going to be out of your experience.
Yeah. Or like David Cohn, who would drop down to that Laredo curve that he would do, and just
I
adding
think they're
a couple.
trying to crack down on some of that. And you see more of that from the guys who come in from foreign parts, right? The guys who have a whole bunch of different arm angles instead of just doing one consistent thing at a time.
That's like the Japanese pitchers love to have 57 different pitches that they throw. Otani's got like 8 of them. Like he needs more tools. What? Okay, so we're at an hour. Let me let you go unless you have anything you want to close up on.
No, I think we covered a lot of different ground here today. So.
Donald Trump to Otani. Yes.
Yeah.
All right, stand by. Let me wrap this thing up. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so